Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to the program. Today's topic is George Washington, Part 6. Thanks for joining us. We are in the year 1784, the American Revolution, the 8-year war for independence for the North American English colonies had been won after a tough 8-year struggle. And it was, again, George Washington was the primary factor in the war. He had a lot of help from Nathanael Greene, from Baron von Steuben, from Lafayette, from Henry Knox, and countless others who went through many hardships, and I think lots of very hard times. And the lesson from the American Revolution, I think, is the importance of character in life. George Washington's character and others' good character. They didn't give up. They persevered. They kept going, and it was hard, and I'm sure they were all discouraged. And I think we can apply that to our own lives. And if we can believe that what's important in life is our own character, to be good people, and to do our duty, to work and contribute, and keep going through hard times. And that eventually things will work out if we just keep going, do our best, and persevere. In 1784, Washington was at home at Mount Vernon, very happy to be at home. And people were communicating with him. He was very popular. He had a lot of visitors, and they were talking about what he had done for our country. And he said this, quote, "You ask how I am to be rewarded for all this. There is one reward that nothing can deprive me of, and that is the consciousness of having done my duty with the strictest rectitude and most scrupulous exactness. The greatest reward is the approbation and affection of a free people. That approbation is the height of my ambition, and will be a full compensation for all my toils and sufferings in the long and painful contest in which we have been engaged." So for the next 5 years, Washington was at home farming, what he loved to do. And he was involved with crop rotation, rotating the fields. He used fish waste as fertilizer. He had many visitors who would come to visit and who would stay overnight, because there was nowhere to stay. There were no hotels, no motels, and so they would stay there. And they all wanted to talk about the war, about Trenton, New Jersey, about Yorktown, about Valley Forge. And Washington would talk about farming, about the weather and his crops and the fields and the soil and what he was trying to do and so forth, and how the different crops were progressing, and how they were doing. And so sometimes the visitors were frustrated because they wanted to talk about the war, and he didn't, because it was over. And I think he was sick of it, and he was actually traumatized by it. There was a lot of painful memories, and he didn't want to talk about it. And he also, he didn't want to brag about it either. So it was over, and he was moving forward, and he needed to make a living, and this was what he was doing. So this was what his attention was on, what he was doing right then. He wasn't living in the past. He was trying to figure out how to succeed as a farmer, and it's not an easy thing to do. George Washington is the father of our country. He's the father of America, but he's also the father of the American mule. Now back then, in farms, there were no tractors, no combines, no mechanized equipment. Everything was done through using animals, especially horses and donkeys. To pull the plows to plow the fields, to harvest, and pull wagons full of crops and produce and so forth. Now the thing is, horses are if you train them and treat them properly, horses are a very obedient animal, and they will work hard for us. However, they don't have a lot of endurance, and they get tired. And plowing a field is tough work. Pulling a plow, and for hours and hours and hours, then they get tired. They're better off. Horses are better for riding or for pulling a carriage, lighter weights. And now then you have a donkey. donkeys are stronger than horses, and they can work longer. They're very tough animals, and they can pull plows, but donkeys are not very obedient. You know, they have a mind of their own. They really don't want to work. They're difficult animals. Now, it was discovered in Europe that if you take a female horse and breed that female horse with a male donkey, you will have an animal called a mule. Mules are sterile, so they have to keep breeding them. They can't reproduce. But a mule is as strong as a donkey and as obedient as a horse. So they're much better they're perfectly suited for farm work and better than a horse or a donkey. And they can plow the fields for a long time and don't get tired and are willing to and are obedient animals. So Washington introduced this concept to the United States, and it spread all over the country, and mules became popular in farm work. Okay, so Washington was having severe financial problems in 1784. Remember, he was not paid for his services as general during the war. His farm lost money during the war. He wasn't home, he had supervisors, people working there. He had the slaves, and they had overseers and so forth. But they were losing money. And then after the war, during this time, he had many, many visitors. People would come and needed to visit him, and he was a good host, and he had to take care of them. And they would stay for a day, several days, or a week, or more than a week. And he had to wine them and dine them and provide a room for them to stay in. During this time, he was growing corn and wheat, fish. He was fishing in the Potomac commercially. He's growing barley, clover, carrots, cabbages, and pumpkins. And he would be in the fields with the workers. He was outside, much of the day, and checking the fences, seeing how the crops were doing, and actually working himself in the fields. One of the visitors who came during this time period was a man named Elkanah Watson, who stayed overnight, came to see Washington, and he had a very bad cough. And during the night, there was a knock on the door, and a figure appeared at his bedside with a cup of tea. It was George Washington, being a good host, who could hear this man coughing. So very nice. Now, there was no photography in 1784. And Washington was extremely popular, a very famous man who'd won the War of Independence, and everyone admired and respected and believed in. So people wanted his likeness. So many painters would come who wanted to paint him. Now this was tough because he agreed. He's a good guy, and he wanted his image preserved for posterity and for the public. And so he would sit for these paintings to be painted, and that would it would take time. You have to sit still. And it was very tedious and difficult, but he did it. And he had this to say about the experience of being painted, his portrait painted so many times. Quote, "I am so hackneyed to the touches of the painter's pencil that I am now altogether at their beck, and sit like patients on a monument, while they are delineating the lines of my face. At first I was impatient at the request, and as restive under the operation as a colt is of the saddle. The next time I submitted very reluctantly, but with less flouncing. Now no dray moves more readily to the pole than I do to the painter's chair." So he was learning how to accept this and be patient in being painted. One of the saddest things happened in 1786. Nathanael Greene, who was the top general in the war, many of the men had financial problems. Greene was from Rhode Island, and again, they didn't profit from their service in the war financially. It was a sacrifice, and so he went home, and he owned land in Rhode Island. But see, one of the problems, if you own land back then or now, is property taxes, paying your property, and those can be difficult. And the war had to be paid for, and the states needed money. And Greene could not pay his property taxes in Rhode Island, and he lost his land. So this was tough, but since he had been the man more than anyone who had driven the British out of the South, He won battles in the South, so he was very popular. I believe Greenville, South Carolina is named after him. And anyway, he was given, the government of Georgia learned he was having financial problems, and so they said, we will give you land, because of what you did for us. So that he moved to Georgia, and these men, they lost a lot of time. They had families to raise and so forth, and they needed to make a living. So he was trying to do that on his farm in Georgia. And sadly, one day he was out in the sun too long. He stayed out in the, it was it can be very hot in Georgia in the summer. He stayed out in the sun too long and died of sunstroke at the age of 44. Oh, so terrible. So I feel so horrible thinking about that, because this great hero of the war, and he was just trying to kind of make up for lost time to support his family, and he died. So sad. And this same year, 1786, the Quakers were pressuring Washington, who was still, very famous and influential. They were pressuring him to end slavery. And slavery was an ongoing, was beginning to become a very important topic of debate and controversy. However, Washington refused to, at this time at least, to play a role to try to fight to end slavery. And he really didn't care what the Quakers had to say, because during the war, they would not help. They were pacifists. They believed in peace at all times, and did not support the war. So he didn't really care what the Quakers had to say. Washington had bills he could not pay. That year, he had a medical bill he couldn't pay. He had taxes he could not pay. And back then, they called it rent on your pew in the church, which is just an offering, but it was a financial commitment he had made to his church, and he couldn't pay that as well. So this was hard, right? Anyway, Washington said this, quote, "Happiness depends more upon the internal frame of a person's mind than on the externals in the world. It is assuredly better to go laughing than crying through the rough journey of life." So this is a wonderful, wonderful attitude, the positive attitude, no matter how bad things are. And of course, what he was going through now certainly wasn't as bad as what he had been through in the war. The English colonies in North America had become independent. However, they really had not become one country. We were like 13 independent countries. Washington had fought a war of independence for 13 small countries, because the national government was so weak that it had almost no authority, the Articles of Confederation. And there were problems because of this. We were like Central America. Look at these, these small, weak countries in Central America. That's what we were like in 1786. The Spanish closed the Mississippi River to American ships, and there was nothing we can do because we were so weak. Goods which passed from state to state were charged tariffs. So this made it very, this really hurt the economy because of that. Taxes to the national government were voluntary. There was the Confederate Congress had very little money, and each state had its own currency. So this was a problem. This was a problem. We were not one country yet. And like I said, like Nathanael Greene, there was another veteran of the war in Massachusetts named Daniel Shays. And he was one of a number of men who could not pay his property tax. And if you don't pay your property tax, the government will take your property from you. And that's what happened to him. This was happening to a number of farmers because the government was there in Massachusetts was trying to raise money, and they needed that money from property taxes that he couldn't pay. He couldn't pay. And so Daniel Shays started a rebellion in Massachusetts. And there were incidents of violence where he was attacked. His rebel army was attacking tax offices and government buildings. And since there was no national government to speak of, very tiny national army, and Massachusetts didn't really have an army either, so no one could stop this Shays rebellion and Shays army. The government couldn't do anything about it, and this was bad. And finally, some rich people in Massachusetts created their own private army to stop Shays' rebellion. And this and this showed that, wow, we really need to do something. We have a problem. You know, we don't. This Shays Rebellion, people thought, we've got to do something. And this stimulated the idea that we needed to create a much stronger national government. And the person who was who mostly worked on this and had been thinking about it was James Madison, who had spent many years reading books about ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the countries of Europe, and studying government and trying to figure out how, you know, what's the best government. So Madison and others who believed that we needed to create a stronger national government organized a meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 called the Constitutional Convention, and for that purpose. And Madison went to see George Washington because he thought, well, if we get Washington to come, people will believe that this is something good. He will give credibility to what we're doing. Because other people thought, well, what are you guys doing? What's this monkey business? Because people were still worried about tyranny and about having a tyrannical government, an abusive government. And so there was skepticism about what was being planned. Anyway, so George did not want to go to the Constitutional Convention. Martha did not want him to go. She thought, George, you have done more than your share for your country, and it's time to let other men contribute. But Washington was finally convinced, because they said, people believe in you. And everyone trusted him. They knew he had good character. So he finally was convinced. They said, we really need you. Your country needs you. So he agreed to attend the Constitutional Convention, and he served as the president of the Constitutional Convention. So that was the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. When Washington arrived in the city, all the bells in the city were rung. And during the convention, he spoke little, but his presence was still felt. He had this very strong presence. And there were a lot of arguments, and Washington's presence was unifying. They spent about 4 months there working on this. Delegates from the 13 states. It was held at the Pennsylvania State House, also known as Independence Hall, where the Continental Congresses of 1774 and 75 had been held, and where the Declaration of Independence was signed. Madison had gotten ideas from Polybius from ancient Rome, from John Locke in England, and Baron Charles de Montesquieu in France. Those were three of the influential thinkers among those that he read and he got ideas from, James Madison. So they were working on the Constitution, and they came up with the Presidential Oath of Office, which goes like this, quote, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." So the President takes an oath to defend the Constitution. That's important to remember. Now, they had a lot of arguing, and the biggest controversy was between big states and small states. The small states were worried that they would be overwhelmed, that this is a republic, and it would have a Congress with representation, and people are going to be voting. So the small states thought, the big states will have all the power because they have so many more people. And so this was a very tough situation. And they finally came up with a compromise that Congress would be composed of two bodies: House of Representatives, where representation would be based on population. So the more people you have in a state, the more representatives you would have in the House of Representatives. And then the Senate. And in the Senate, every state would have 2 senators. Okay? So this would be helpful to the small states. They would have equal power in the Senate. And today, look at California, has a huge population. They have 2 senators. And then there's Montana, very small population, and they also have 2 senators. So this was the compromise that was reached between the big states and the small states. Now, another major problem was slavery. The Declaration of Independence has the words, "All men are created equal." And, slavery was a total contradiction. They thought, my God, here we're talking about freedom and the equality of man, and we have slavery. This is terrible. It's wrong. We should end slavery. But the compromise they reached was that they would accept slavery. It would be ignored in the Constitution, because otherwise the southern states would not have joined the Union, and would not have signed the Constitution. So, in a sense, they kicked the can down the road, and slavery remained a huge problem up until the Civil War, when finally, a war was fought to free the slaves. Anyway, so the Constitution was finished, and the delegates signed it, and then it had to be ratified by the states. They had to have 2/3 of the states needed to be to ratify it for it to become law. George Washington, and so that was ongoing in the months to come after they went home in the late summer of 1787. Washington wrote this about the Constitution, quote, "A government of the people, that is to say, a government in which all power is derived from and at stated periods reverts to them, and in its operation it is purely a government of laws, made and executed by the fair substitutes of the people alone. It is clear to my conception that no government before introduced among mankind ever contained so many checks and such efficacious restraints to prevent it from degenerating into any species of oppression." He continued about the Constitution, quote, "It appears to me little short of a miracle that the delegates from so many different states, which states are also different from each other in their manners, circumstances, and prejudices, should unite in forming a system of national government so little liable to well-founded objections." Washington continued, quote, "My creed is simply, first, that the general government is not invested with more powers than are indispensably necessary. Secondly, that these powers are so distributed among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches that it can never be in danger of degenerating into a monarchy, so long as there shall remain any virtue in the body of the people." That's an important point. He's saying we will have freedom. We will keep our freedom. We will be a free people as long as we are virtuous, as long as we are a good people. That's an important point to remember, something I believe in very strongly. "The proposed Constitution is provided with more checks and barriers against the introduction of tyranny than any government hitherto instituted among mortals." So we had the government, the three branches of government: the presidency, the executive branch, and then the legislative branch with Congress, and then the Supreme Court and the court system. Washington continued, quote, "The adoption of the Constitution will demonstrate as visibly the finger of Providence as any possible event in the course of human affairs can ever designate." So again, he's saying that he believes God is behind us, creating this wonderful document and creating our national government. Now, Madison and those who were involved in this creation had received inspiration from ancient sources. Now, the ancient Greeks, as historians know, invented democracy. However, this was on a small scale, and they were never able to have a large Greek republic. In fact, they lost their freedom. They were conquered. They had a civil war, a Peloponnesian War. They lost their freedom, and then the Romans took over them. Now, the Romans had a republic, and it lasted for centuries, and they had a president and a Congress and a Senate. Those are all Roman words. However, when the Romans lost their virtue, in other words, when they became degenerate and corrupt, their republic became an empire. Now, in 1787 and 88, the first two big textile factories making cotton and wool opened in New England, and this was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which had started in Europe, especially in England, mostly in England, and spread to other parts of Europe. And then this really changed the world completely in the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution. In June of 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, and it became law. So that's how it was. And then there was talk that Washington would be the first president. And he said this about the presidency, quote, "Notwithstanding my advanced season of life, my increasing fondness for agricultural amusements, and my growing love of retirement, it will be no one of these motives, nor the hazard to which my former reputation might be exposed, or the terror of encountering new fatigues and troubles, that would deter me from an acceptance, but a belief that some other person who had less inclination to be excused could execute all the duties as satisfactorily as myself." George Washington did not want to become the first president. The same thing. And Martha was against it. He was against it. He didn't want it. He was happy. He was tired. He was worn out. He'd had enough. He had made his contribution. But again, the same thing. They said, "We need you. Your country needs you. This new government, lacks credibility." There's a lot of people who are suspicious of it. And they think, what is this nonsense? What are they trying to pull? Is there going to be tyranny and despotism? So he was finally convinced to accept the presidency. The first presidential election in American history was held between December 15th, 1788 and January 10th, 1789. And 10 states had voting. The popular vote was 43,782, and all of those votes were cast for George Washington, 100%. And so he received all 69 electoral votes. So this is really something. No one else was considered. No one else was considered. Everyone assumed that and he was universally admired and respected. So he was, you see these third world dictators, they'll have an election where they win 99% of the vote, and there's been cheating and so forth. There was no cheating here. He received 100% of the vote because of the love people felt for him and their gratitude for what he had done in the Revolution, and how much they believed in him, and that he was a good man, and they could trust him, that he was honest, and he would create a good government for our country. So Washington was preparing to travel to New York City, and he had to borrow $600. New York City is where the first capital was. For some reason, it had been Philadelphia for a long time, and then it became New York for 1 year. He had to borrow $600 to travel from his home at Mount Vernon to New York City. And he was, because of his financial problems, just imagine. His mother refused to go to his inauguration because she considered him a bad son and for neglecting her during the war, and she didn't go along with all of the things that had been done so far. Washington was notified on April 14th that he was unanimously elected president. 2 days later, he departed for New York City. And on the way, he passed through Alexandria, Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, Washington said this, quote, "If I have distressing apprehensions, I am supported by a confidence that the most gracious being who has hitherto watched over the interests and averted the perils of the United States will never suffer so fair an inheritance to become a prey to anarchy, despotism, or any other species of oppression." It was taken for granted that Washington would be the first president, and his journey from Mount Vernon to New York City for his inauguration was the parade of a national hero. Every town and city on the way held a celebration, and this was a wonderful thing. It was it really slowed him down, made it kind of a long trip, because everywhere he had to stop and receive the speeches, and the people would come out to see him and cheer for him and so forth. So this was actually a very beautiful thing. It gave them a chance to thank him. So this was a wonderful thing. As he traveled from Mount Vernon to New York City, every town and city on the way held a celebration. And it gave the people a chance to thank him. All the people who were very grateful to him for what he had done in winning the War of Independence. And he was their hero. So next time we're going to talk about George Washington's presidency and what he went through, the political issues that he faced, and establishing the first national government. So thank you so much for watching. May the road rise to meet you. May the wind be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of His hand. Thanks for watching. God bless you. See you next time.